Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'm going to be trying to predict what the race to world first raid comps are going to look like, specifically what the kill comp for Mythic Sylvanas will be. This is just kind of a fun little exercise for me, so I wouldn't take anything I say here too seriously, especially in terms of building your own raid comp, right? Don't do anything like that, but I just think the whole kind of puzzle of comp building, specifically at the highest level, is really interesting, so I figured I would put out a video on it, and maybe it'll be something fun to revisit a few weeks down the line just to see how stupid I am. I'll be giving a little bit of an explanation on my choices, but nothing extremely in-depth. But luckily, if you're looking for that, I do have videos for ranged, melee, tanks, and healers over on my channel, or linked in the description below, that go into way more detail, so you can check those out if you're interested. I would also love to hear what you guys are thinking on this specific topic, so drop what you believe the world first raid comp for Sylvanas is going to be down in the comments below, and again, we can compare in a few weeks to see who was right. With all that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to be notified when I post more Warcraft content. And let's start off with what I think is the easiest role to predict correctly in healers. Now, the reason for that is because I think not too much has really changed for healers going to 9.1. There was, of course, the Holy Paladin nerfs, the damage nerfs there. But honestly, they were so far ahead anyways, I don't think it's going to change much. You're still going to want two. Obviously, the first one brings you that passive damaged aura reduction 3%. That's basically a raid buff, right? So you definitely want at least one. And I think in general, passive damage is very good for world first stuff, especially from your healers. So you definitely want that for sure. And for that reason also, I think there's definitely going to be at least one disc. Barrier's value has gone up slightly with the nerfs to AMZ. So the passive damage from disc combined with that, I think definitely makes disc still used despite the spiritual nerfs. And again, spiritual I think is going to be kind of timing dependent. I'm sure it'll be used on at least some of the fights. Not sure entirely if it'll be used for Sylvanas in particular, just because evangelism is right there, has a ton of throughput. But again, spiritual, much worse than before, but still definitely usable talent. And frankly, again, the passive damage of disc is just super strong. So these three healers providing a ton of damage from the healer role is very important for the race to world first. For the fourth healer, I think it's going to be a Resto Shaman filling out the roster. They got Ankh Totem, which is great situationally. They got Spirit Link, which is great situationally. Super solid throughput. Not very mana dependent, similar to Holy Paladin. So they're in a very good spot as well still. And I think they're a pretty solid choice to round out that healer core. If we do see any 5 healer fights, I think it's likely to be dependent on what the fight is. So if there's a really good use for Spirit Link or Ankh Totem, or you really need the overall throughput, I can see a Shaman going in there for that 5th healer spot. Or if Barrier for whatever reason has value, or you don't need the Shaman things and you just want the extra little bit of healer damage, a disc is another great option there. For Sylvanas in particular, I think we're going to be in a 4 healer situation, so these are the 4 here. But in case there is a 5th healer, I think it'll be situational between another Resto Shaman and another Disc Priest. From there, let's kind of move on to tanks and melee. I'm going to kind of talk about them together because they kind of go hand in hand because of raid buffs. Now let's just put these guys all up here. We have Havoc Vengeance, we have Brewmaster Windwalker, we have Blood Unholy Frost. We have, where's the warriors? Am I blind? There they are. Prot and Fury and Arms. We've got the Paladins for Prot and Ret. And then we have the Druids with Guardian, Feral, and then Boomkin, obviously. But again, I'm going to focus on the melee right now, at least. So we'll start here. Vengeance was a pretty common pick in the first tier, Castle Nathria. I think their popularity is definitely going to go down because Havoc received a bunch of nice single target buffs, which is their biggest weakness here. And of course, for some reason, Havoc has Darkness and Vengeance does not. So for that reason alone, I think, and Havoc being much better than they were in Season 1, I think you're going to see Havocs being used as the Demon Hunter raid buff. And without that Demon Hunter raid buff, the value of Vengeance kind of goes down a fair bit to the point where I don't see you really picking it over the other tanks. They're still very strong. They're still very tanky. Their AoE damage is still pretty good. Their single target's lacking, but they don't really bring anything else, again, because they don't have Darkness, which honestly I really do think they should, but that's another video entirely. But so since Havoc brings Darkness, Vengeance doesn't, and Havoc is in a decent spot, I think you're going to pick that Havoc for that Darkness. Brewmaster and Windwalkers. Brewmasters are a very popular tank, but they're just relatively middle of the pack. in pretty much all categories in terms of the tank comparables. And Windwalker, I think it gets a lot of flack for like the whole scaling thing, but I really don't get that argument in this expansion because honestly, Windwalkers are looking quite good going to next patch. And frankly, they're probably one of, if not the best 2-minute burst spec in the game. And so because of that, neither of them bring any great specific raid utility like Darkness, right? They both have Mystic Touch, obviously, so it's the same kind of situation as Havoc and Vengeance, but without the Darkness in play. And for that, I would actually say that I think you'd rather go with the Windwalker in this situation because it has that solid, definable strength in 2-minute burst AoE damage. So I think we're going to see a Windwalker in this comp, not a Brewmaster. From there, let's talk Death Knights for a second. So I think this might be where my list differs a fair bit from what I've heard a lot of people in the community saying. AMZ is dead, so, you're not going to bring DPS DKs anymore. I don't think that's true at all, especially after the recent slight buff to AMZ, where it got knocked back down to a 2-minute CD, and they increased the scaling to 150%. I think the main thing that's changed is that you can't use AMZ the way you're used to using it in Castle Nathria. That's 100% true for a DPS DK. For a Blood DK, you can use it pretty much the exact same way. It's a very large shield. Conservatively, I think it's about 180k absorb, which works it out to be a 900k overall damage absorb, which is very big, right? That's going to cover pretty much whatever you need it to. So in that case, Blood DK basically has old AMZ, but I think Blood DK's problem is just their damage is too low. And as we said here, healer damage is very important. Taking damage also pretty damn important for the race, because again, they're going in their under gear. They want as much damage as possible. They need as much damage as possible. And I think for that, Blood DK just does too little DPS. And I think DPS DKs are a little bit underrated in terms of their AMZ. So a conservative estimate, right, for Blood was 180k on the shield. I think for DPS DKs, it's about 80k on the shield, because again, obviously, Blood DKs, they have higher health. They can combine it with Vampiric, and they also have higher verse numbers, right? Most DPS DKs aren't going to have a ton of verse. They'll have a little bit, especially if they're using PvP gear at the beginning. But I would guess that they wouldn't be above 10% verse. And so given that, it's about, again, conservatively 80k, which means a 400k absorb, which isn't going to work on your entire raid, but what it does work on is half your raid. And so if you have a pair of DPS DKs, and for any absorb you would want to, you kind of split your raid into 2 groups and have an AMZ in each, you can then move that up to covering 40k per player, which is well over half of their HP, which is a pretty decent absorb overall and is going to help with a lot of damage. You can also opt to remove your tanks from this to increase the absorb to 44k-ish per player, which again, that's a pretty solid absorb per player and very, very near what the old AMZ was. It's a different use, right? You have to split up your raid, which requires a bit more coordination, but I think we can expect that level of coordination from a higher ranked troop. On top of that, Unholy's seen no changes, man. Unholy is a good spec. They were not only brought for their AMZ. They have really, really good single target damage. They have really, really good execute. They're prime targets for buffs, like PI during army, like Necrolord banner during army, which we'll talk about in a second here. But they're a very, very solid spec, and I think they're going to remain useful because grips are useful as well. They're going to remain useful, and I think there's actually going to be 2 Unholy DKs is my prediction. 2 Unholy DKs, and to be honest with you, if they feel like they really need AMZs and they want to do a rotation of like 2 sets of AMZs, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if you saw 4 Unholy DKs. I know a lot of people are thinking Unholy DKs are gone, but I think there's going to be 2 for sure. Maybe that's my hot take because I think a lot of people have been pretty down on Unholy DKs after the AMZ nerf, but I think they're still super solid. I think they'll still see play. Moving on to Warriors, like I mentioned, Prot Warriors, they have that Necrolord banner now. It's not as good as people initially thought it would be, but it's still a decent DPS increase per player. Again, conservatively, it's around 200 DPS on a single player, and it hits 2 extra, right? So that's a nice little boost to technically the Prot Warriors DPS, even though it doesn't show up on their meters. And again, I'm being conservative here with the banner. 200 DPS, I think, right? You're going to be hitting, for the most part, probably Unholy DKs, I would assume. Maybe trying to hit some other big mastery specs, such as Boomkin, something like that. But we'll have to wait and see exactly how that gets played, because I'm sure they will find better uses for it than I can think of. But I think it's definitely something that is very, very strong, and definitely boosts warrior DPS to be a little bit to be a clear third, maybe sometimes second, depending on the fight, if Guardians can't really catweave. So their DPS is definitely very, very good. They're very tanky, right? Shield block is exceptionally strong. Spell reflect is exceptionally strong. They bring a raid CD in Rallying Cry. Again, very, very strong thanks to the conduit that buffs it a ton. And I think Prot Warrior is going to be your first tank here. Super strong. Big fan of Prot Warrior. And I think it's going to be quite good on the Sylvanas fight in particular. Now, in terms of Fury, I also think Fury is actually in a really good spot. I think especially with the Sinful Surge legendary, their Execute damage is looking very, very good, because you can get pretty close, if not exactly 100% uptime on your Recklessness during that Condemn window. And big Execute damage, always good. They also give pretty solid like 5 to 6 target cleave damage at all times, so they're a pretty decent pick to kind of round out some weaknesses, which we're going to talk about in this raid comp later. So we're trying to think big picture here. And again, they bring that Rallying Cry, right? It's not like a Havoc Vengeance situation where only one of them brings the CD. Both of these guys bring the CD, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a couple Rallying Cries in a group, especially when it's now super buffed thanks to that conduit. So I also think in that melee, we might see a Fury Warrior for that reason. Now, you're bringing this buff from the Prot Warrior, so if you're hit any kind of super melee unfriendly fights, getting to Sylvanas in particular, I think it's fairly reasonable to just drop this Warrior and add another range or whatever, right? And that's why you have that Warrior there, so you do have the freedom to drop this Warrior if you so choose. But I think for Sylvanas in particular, I think Fury is going to be pretty solid. Moving on to Paladins. Now, Paladins, of course, have the problem of being a little squishy, and so in World First raiding, the big issue is, do you want to take the risk to bring the Prot Paladin? Because if you can pull off bringing a Prot Paladin, they do an absolute ton of damage. But again, it's pretty hard to argue that they're relatively squishier than the other tanks. And I'm sure, I mean, I can see the subtweets just coming out as we speak. But I mean, that's just the truth. They are relatively squishier compared to these other tanks. They're just scary to run, right? It's very, very true, especially at the World First level. When you're going in under eye level, it's scary as hell to play Paladin. It's just true. Now, if you can pull it off, it's gonna be worth it if you can pull it off, right? And right now, having tanked all of the bosses during raid testing, I think there's exactly one spot where I'm super concerned about Prot Paladins, and that's actually the Phase 3 of Mythic Sylvanas, where she gets her bumped up Tank Buster. I think throughout the rest of the 9.5 fights, right, even Sylvanas Phase 1, I'm not super concerned about it. Going up through the rest of the other 9 fights, not super concerned about it. But that Phase 3 Sylvanas is a bit spooky. And if you're concerned that's going to be kind of Nathrius levels of damage, maybe you don't risk bringing that Prot Paladin, right? I think this is something that you're going to wait until Heroic Week, and you see how bad Sylvanas is in Phase 3 before you actually decide if you're going to bring that Prot Paladin or not. But I think they're definitely a tentative option for sure. Again, because of that huge damage advantage they have over the rest of the tanks. And frankly, Spell Warding is looking pretty good on a few of the boss fights. So that's definitely a maybe for tanks. In terms of Ret, I think they're actually in a pretty good spot right now. Again, they have a ton of utility. Their raid buff, you're not really going to consider it or factor it into the equation because you have those Holy Paladins down there bringing that for sure. And so when you're talking about Ret, you're pretty much just talking about what they bring outside of that. They have a solid set of Paladin utility, right? All Paladins have that. The immunity is very strong. They have that short CD burst, right? Shorter CD than a monk, but they put out a little bit less damage, right? But if you need that burst on a lower cooldown, I can see the Ret being there. Or if you're doing some sort of immunity strat in particular for kel'thuzad, I can see an argument for bringing in a Ret. But in general, I don't think Ret's going to see play in the World First race, at least not for Sylvanas. In terms of the last tank we have here, Guardian Druid, I think is also a very, very good option for a tank. Super durable and puts out less damage than the Prot Paladin, of course, but I would say probably more damage than the warrior, especially in single target. You're also never going to be really concerned about your guardian druid getting insta-gibbed in this last phase of Sylvanas, so it's a little bit of a safer pick, I would say, than the paladin. But of course, you're going to be giving up on that damage. You're going to be giving up on something like spell warding. You're going to be giving up on all that extra set of paladin utilities, right? So you are giving up a bit by picking that safer option. But again, I think this is actually going to depend how Sylvanas works out in Heroic Week. If they do Heroic Sylvanas and they look at the numbers that she does on Heroic, they compare that to the numbers on Mythic, and they're like, yeah, you know what, Prop Paladins, they're going to be just fine on this. There you go, Prop Paladins, you're in the race. If they say, yeah, this was a little rough tanking on Heroic, it's going to be an absolute nightmare to tank on Mythic, similar to Denathrius, again, with lower eye level in particular, then maybe it's no longer Prop Paladin time to shine, maybe it's a Guardian Druid time to shine, right? Another thing, actually, I wouldn't actually be terribly surprised if the tank comp is double Prop Warrior, right? You get another banner, all right? Another banner that's a bunch more DPS. I still think it's, in general, a little bit lower than Guardians, but the big thing for Guardians is that they really, really rely to get good single target damage is being able to cat weave. And Sylvanas in particular, Phase 1 seems like okay-ish for cat weaving. It's not super great, but it's not terrible either. Phase 3, again, it's a bit of a wild card right now. We don't fully know what's going to happen in Phase 3 on Mythic, right? Anduin is there. The Jailer is there. Is that going to be a one tank or a one mob kind of tank fight? Or is you're going to have to fight Anduin as well? Is that going to be a cleave fight? We don't really know. So it's kind of hard to say if Guardians are going to be able to cat weave in that last phase. But if they are, they're able to get that damage boost. If they're not, their damage boost, they still have decent damage, but it's less of a damage lead over the next tank, to the point where a Prop Warrior with Banner might be able to overcome a Guardian Druid damage. So we'll have to wait and see. Again, we don't know that. Maybe they do know that based on data mining and stuff. Nothing I've seen has indicated towards whether or not there's going to be a 1, 2, or 3 target kind of phase in that Phase 3 Sylvanas. But I would not be surprised to see any of these 3 tanks in for Sylvanas alongside another Prot Warrior. So what I think, again, I think if week 1 Sylvanas is not too terribly high damage, I think you can great argument for the Prop Paladin. If week 1 Sylvanas is super big tank damage, I think it's a good argument for a Guardian. Prot Warrior, I think you could make a good argument either way. They're a much safer pick. Again, I think they're a little bit more safer pick than the Guardian Druid, right? Because the Guardian Druid still has to be able to cat weave to put out that big damage. So this is like a generally more safe option if you're not sure what's going to happen in Phase 3, right? If the Guardian Druid ends up not being able to cat weave in Phase 3, that's a big hit to their damage. So this is like an even safer pick. But we'll have to see what guilds do, right? If they're going for the safe direction or they go for like the risky play of the Paladin, right? So I think these 2 are going to be the most popular, and kind of that's my guess. Could be either way. I'm gonna say Prop Paladin though. I'm feeling the Prop Paladin. Again, Guardian Druid is very close second, and I think Prot Warrior is a little bit of a safer pick for the second tank option, but we'll have to wait and see. In terms of Feral, I think they do really, really good single target. They're fairly durable, actually. But I think the biggest thing with Feral is that, again, we don't need more single target damage in this comp, as you'll see later. We're trying to kind of be a well-rounded comp and cover weaknesses of some of our other classes in the specific comp. And I think Feral is going to run into the same problem as Rogue, actually, where, again, Rogue, really, really good single target, really, really good 2-target cleave, has that execute, probably one of the highest DPS melee going into patch 9.1. But again, they're not really covering what our big weakness is here, which is more kind of AoE damage. Outlaw, obviously good in the 5 to 6 target, kind of more a sustained damage as opposed to a burst damage. Again, burst damage is much more liked in the World First stuff. And so I don't really think there's going to be a spot for Rogues. I think the big kind of saving grace for Rogues is if maybe Guardian is hard, right? If Guardian is a real hard fight, I can see Rogues kind of being subbed in, because it's not very melee and friendly either, right? You can sub in a bunch of Rogues there for even some of the range specs, some of the melee specs, right? To get that big single target damage. Also, if you're doing an immunity strat on KT, like I mentioned with Ret, there is the opportunity to do an immunity strat on kel'thuzad. Rogues would be a good option for that if that strat's the one that ends up getting used. Not 100% sure on that, but I think for Sylvanas in particular, I haven't really seen anything where I would expect an immunity strat to develop, but I mean, it totally could. If that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised to see rogues, but at least now, given what I currently know about the fight, I don't think we're going to see rogues on that Sylvanas kill. Survival, it's got big AoE damage, not so good single target, very, very squishy, really doesn't bring anything else that some of these other specs already down here don't bring to the table, and so I don't think we're going to see them. Enhance, it's a bit of a middle of the pack DPS in pretty much all scenarios. Arms also isn't the spec right now for warriors, right? We've got Fury, and so Wind Fury is not going to get a ton of value for these other specs, so I don't think we're going to see Enhance here either. Moving on from these melee specs then, we got those 5 here. That's what I think is going to be in for Sylvanas. We've got range specs up next. Let's just put them all out here, right? We got mages, we got warlocks, we got shadow priests, we have boomkins, we have hunters again, and then we have shamans again. Okay, mages. You have to have one, for sure. You have to have one. Intellect, super important, mandatory. You need one. The wild card for me for mages is Arcane. Honestly, I'm a bit unsure about the current state of Arcane. It's definitely the spec for mages I'm least familiar with. I'm hearing some crazy things about Kyrian Arcane. I'm not sure in practice how it's going to work. Fire saw a bunch of nerfs, mostly targeted at Mythic Plus. It does hurt their single target a bit. Their combust cooldown has gone up from that 60-ish seconds to like 65-70 seconds. So I think it's going to depend on timings specifically for fire. The timings work out better for fire, right? If it's like 65, 70, 75 second timers between like specific ad spawns like on KT or the Sylvanas platforms, etc., they could have a lot of value playing fire, and especially, right, fire is the only one that can really take their execute. I know Arcane has an execute legendary, but I believe the damage loss is just insane compared to the Arcane Harmony legendary, so they won't really realistically ever run it. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see, frankly, like all 3 of the mage specs throughout the course of the race. Fire has a spot depending on timings. I think Frost is also looking pretty good on Sylvanas phase 1 and 2, but then phase 3 gets a little weird with Icy Veins uptime, and that kind of leaves Arcane, which I'm not fully, again, not fully sure about entirely for Arcane. So maybe there's some super insane spec. Personally, though, I think we're going to see one mage, but again, if Arcane does some insane things, then maybe it's possible that we see a bunch of Arcane mages here, but for now, I'm going to just put in the one mage. Warlocks are next. I think there's going to be at least a couple Warlocks. They're looking super good in this raid. Flexible. All 3 specs do 3 different things, right? You've got the cleave and the AoE burst of Destro. You've got the single target of Demo, and then you've got like the spread AoE and the execute of Affliction, right? So for Sylvanas in particular, I think it's going to depend how that last phase turns out, right? If that last phase ends up being like a 2-target cleave scenario, Destro gains a lot of value, Affliction starts to gain value. If it's like a 3-target cleave, if the Jailer gets involved, Affliction may be gaining a lot of value in that fight. Obviously, it has Execute as well. Destro in general, though, is pretty good for phase 1 and phase 2. Maybe it's just a 1 target and you really, really need that single target. Maybe Demo ends up being the thing for that specific fight. But these are two slots that are able to be very flexible depending on the fight all the way through the entire raid. And so they can kind of change to what you need as you gear them up. And for that reason, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if you saw more Warlocks. I think their major downside right now is that their single target really doesn't have a super good execute, right? Demo in that sense. But they still have very, very strong damage and multiple different types of damage. So they're going to be a super flexible class. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see more than this. I'm going to go with 2 though. And then we have Shadow Priest. Not sure how much of a hot take this is, but I think Shadow Priests are going to be the stacked class this raid. The one caveat that they're obviously a little bit one-dimensional in raids, and that's kind of why this comp is going to be built around kind of shoring up the weaknesses of Shadow Priest, right? Which is like they do huge single target damage, they have really, really strong execute, but they can have some trouble in kind of like AoE and burst AoE situations, right? We have pretty much all these melee that can help with that. Something like Destro, really good at target swapping, which Shadow Priest can't do because it's on the same row as Mindbender. So you have like Warlocks, Destro, very, very good at target swapping. Mage can cover a bunch of things, right? The Burst AoE, the Funnel AoE, whatever the hell Arcane does. And that's just basically so you can stack these big guns in terms of the damage output and just absolutely nuke bosses, right? They'll obviously be super good on a single target fight like Guardian, right? Vampiric Embrace could be nice too for those kind of nuke phases. It's a little bit of lower healing per second, but it's honestly, I mean, any heals is better than nothing. They are bringing a little bit of something to the raid environment. I think a problem where obviously KT, if you're doing that immunity strat I was talking about, they might be a class you start dropping for KT specifically to add more, something like mages, right? They have Ice Block, more rogues into the raid group, specifically for an immunity type strat, maybe a Red Paladin or two, right? But outside of that, I think Shadow Priests are going to be very, very strong. It again depends on what phase 3 looks like. But, I mean, Shadow Priest pretty good at both single target, and frankly, their 2-target cleave is nothing to scoff at either. They're pretty decent at that as well. Obviously, they're going to need help getting through phase 2 in particular, but phase 1 dealing with those spears, they might need a little bit of help with that as well, and that's kind of what we're going to be building this kind of comp around, to help specifically with those kind of things, so these Shadow Priests can kind of carry on the Sylvanas boss damage portion. Speaking of AoE, we talk about Boomkins. I'm gonna go with 2 Boomkins. 2 Boomkins. Starfall is going to be so good in phase 1 Sylvanas. Outside of that, Boomkins are a little bit cringe because they're a 3-minute class, right? It doesn't normally line up. A lot of these classes are like 2-minute classes or sub 2-minute classes, right? Like I think Shadow Priests are like a 70-second-ish class when they're getting PI and Night Fae. Obviously Fire Mage, 65 to 70 seconds. That kind of thing. So like relatively short cooldowns for the most part. Boomkins are 3 minutes, a little bit weird, but they do a ton of bursts in those 3 minutes. Whether they're using Night Fae front-loaded burst, Venthyr back-loaded burst, or even Kyrian, frankly, if that ends up netting them more overall damage. Right, there is that Kyrian legendary, which kind of gives your partner stats, and it would be kind of funny to see this giant chain. Actually, let me open up Paint. Apologies in advance for the flashbang. Alright, so there's Paint. But I think it'd be super interesting, right, if you're in this kind of like simp meta, where you have like Shadow Priest 1, right, Shadow Priest 2, and these guys are both running the PI legendary, right? Then you got Shadow Priest 3, Shadow Priest 4, they're running whatever the big Shadow Priest legendary is. Let's say SFP, I think it's what it is right now. But we'll see if Talbotars ends up being better. I think it's SFP right now, though, especially if you're Night Fae, right? These guys are wearing the PI legendary, right? Shadow Priests are a bit weird on the timers for PI a little bit. So you have a Shadow Priest PIing another Shadow Priest, and you're assuming they have similar timers, so they're both going to get decent use out of that PI. So you technically have PIs for all 4 of your Shadow Priests, right? Then maybe both Boomkins, right? Let's say the Boomkins are Kyrian for whatever reason, right? They're bonded. Again, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I just think this would be a super interesting chain, and I'm probably completely overthinking this, but this was just something cool, which I obviously could never test, but would be interesting to see how it works out. You got a Boomkin, and this is a Kyrian Boomkin with the Kyrian legendary, and he's bonded to this Shadow Priest, and that can just be sent whenever the Shadow Priest, again, Shadow Priests are about a 70-second CD, so they can just send that with that. And you got the other Boomkin down to this guy. And you got these Shadow Priests, they have a spare PI, they don't really need it. I don't believe if they're already getting their own PI from these guys. And so maybe these Shadow Priests are doing something like PIing the next best target, right? So like with Army, obviously that's going to be an Unholy DK. If they don't have Army, it's probably someone else, but let's just say, you know, this is on the armies. They're PIing the Unholy DKs on the armies, right? And then you just have a Prot Warrior here who is bannering the Unholy DKs also in their armies. Lots of buffs going all the way around. I thought this was something that's pretty cool to think about. Again, I don't know how this is going to work in practice. This probably, I mean, if this is assuming Boomkins go Kyrian, right? I don't know if that's going to happen. Probably won't, to be honest, but it might happen. I don't know if this is a net DPS increase. I obviously have not done any math. This was just kind of an idea. right? Like using this PI Lego to do another Shadow Priest so that they can PI someone else. I don't know if that's a net DPS increase or not, or then having just these Shadow Priests all PI themselves and just kind of all run their best legendary here. And obviously like Boomkin's net increase from being like Venthyr or Night Fae, obviously. But yeah, I just thought it was something worth mentioning and kind of not really part of my thought process, but something I thought was maybe potentially interesting there. Tangent aside, we're done with the tangent. I don't even know what I was talking about. Boomkins, yes, mass AoE, very good. They're going to cover that phase 1 spears. Those spears that come down, I guess they're giant arrows. I'm going to call them spears. The spears that come down in Sylvanas in phase 1, there's a ton of them. They're a bit spread. Starfall Dream, they're going to be great for that, especially if that overlap stays the same, where literally everyone in your raid gets speared during the phase transition, going from phase 1 to phase 2. Super spooky. Having a couple Boomkins, maybe even a third or fourth Boomkin for that. Very, very good. But honestly, I think Boomkins are going to fall a little bit flat in that final phase if it's a single target phase in particular. They have that really good single target burst damage, like I mentioned, for Venthyr and Night Fae. But outside of that, their single target is a little bit not so great. But they really, really cover those spears well, and they're do fine in phase 2 as well. And they'll just have that burst for phase 3. So I don't think you're going to want too many Boomkins. If that phase 3 ends up being like a 2 or 3 target, though, I mean, Boomkins are going to be super, super good in that kind of situation. But again, we don't really know what that phase is going to look like. So I wouldn't even be surprised if like a comp is one way, they get to phase 3 on the boss, they see what the boss is like in phase 3, and the comp gets adjusted accordingly to what you need to deal with phase 3, right? The first time they see phase 3, they see, oh, phase 3 is going to be a 2-target cleave fight. Well, we can now adjust, right? We can insert what we think is going to be better for 2-target cleave and go from there. Or they see it phase 3 is a 1-target fight. Okay, we can adjust. So again, we don't really know, but this is going to be my best guess at the moment. Hunter. I mean, your best shot was the Sylvanas bow being just super overtuned. That was your shot, man. They have an immunity, but you wouldn't bring it over like a mage for a KT strat, I don't think. I mean, they have like the 5-target 2-minute burst, but like Windwalker just does that better. So yeah, I mean, Hunter's sad Hunter noises. That's all I can say. At least for the Race to World First. Again, yeah, this is Race to World First stuff. This is my prediction on that. Don't read into this too much. Sorry, Hunter. Elemental Shaman is an interesting one. I think it's potentially good, specifically if you need that 60-second burst, right? They have Stormkeeper versus like you can't wait for that 65 to 70 seconds for that Fire Mage burst. They're good single target in AoE. Not the best in either. I think they'd be a pretty solid phase 2 spec. Specifically, and obviously they're going to be pretty decent in phase 3 if it's 1 to 2 targets, but I don't think they really stand out from the rest of these specs in any one of those categories. Again, just being really, really solid in both, but not the best, right? So they're a decent spec. I wouldn't be surprised if I saw an Ellie Shaman or two, but at least for my comp, if you've been counting, there's currently no space in my comp. This is my 20-man comp right now. Oh, and the Guardian Druid, just in case that Sylvanas hits too hard. But yeah, there it is. What I think the world first Sylvanas raid comp is going to look like. Prot Warrior and Prot Paladin, possibly Guardian Druid, depending on how Sylvanas hits in week 1 Heroic week. Too early to break that, obviously. Melee, I think we're going to have a Havoc. Windwalker, 2 Unholies, and a Fury Warrior. For ranged, I think we're going to have 1 Mage. Not really sure on the spec here. It's going to be depending on timings. We've got 2 Warlocks, which I think are going to be Destro, but again, it's going to depend on what Phase 3 is. They'll probably switch specs depending on what Phase 3 is. 4 Shadow Priests to kind of carry that boss damage. Boomkins to help get you through Phase 1 and Phase 2. And in the healer department, 2 Prot Paladins and a Disc to bring all that different damage reduction and all that passive healer damage. And then Shaman for that just big general throughput and really, really good utility cooldowns. I'm super interested to hear what you guys think, though, so head down in the comments section, call me an idiot, then put your money where your mouth is, and drop your own comp list for what you think the first raid team to beat Mythic Sylvanas will be, and we'll see down the line a few weeks from now when Sylvanas has been defeated how everyone did. That's all for now, though. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really does help, and I will see you in the next one.